um, as we're coming kind of out of COVID and kind of still in the midst of COVID, on the, what I like to say, the tail end of COVID. And really, as parents, especially if your children are in secondary education, so, between preschoolers through high school age, really the impact COVID has had on all of our children academically. And so I think that, as parents, really having a conversation around what parent engagement looks like now, prior to possibly pre-COVID, especially when we were in remote learning, where parents became a large part of helping their students succeed in their classes. And so we're going to go ahead and jump in and take a deep dive into this topic. Like I said, this is a real, open discussion, open dialogue. We'll talk a little bit about, have kind of a getting started. I'm going to share my screen now because I do have a PowerPoint prepared. So I will put in slide view. Okay. Everybody can see that okay? All right. So once again, welcome to this presentation. I guess you can see right off, I'm an Aggie, so I'll kind of talk about that in a second. But really, really impactful topic as we kind of navigate how we engage parents, educators, and our children in ensuring that they're successful academically. So once again, as Erica said, this topic is about parent engagement and academic success. How can I support my child? When I do these sessions, I always like to call them collaborative learning sessions, because I believe that as I'm presenting, I'm always learning as well. And I think as presenters and educators, although we may be a subject matter expert in whatever we talk about, I believe that it's always a learning process because we learn from others. So I'm constantly learning from parents, constantly learning from other professionals. So I like to use the term collaborative learning session and what I call working together. And so we'll be looking at issues surrounding accountability, authenticity, commitment, give and take, diversity, and respect when we're looking at how we can ensure that our students, that our children are successful academically. And so once again, this is a community of learning. We learn from each other as we go through this session. There may be things that kind of spark an experience or spark, your curiosity or inquiry. So I encourage you to definitely use this as a platform of community learning during this presentation. So as we get started, just a little bit about me. I am Deanna Mcquiddy. I am the speech program director and associate professor at North Carolina A&T State University. So I manage the speech language pathology program and speech communication concentration. I've been at A&T about 20 years now. I am a fellow Aggie myself, undergrad, and I'm a speech language pathologist by trade. So I went to A&T for undergrad and then received my master's and doctorate in speech pathology. And so I'm really excited when we have these talks about engaging students and parents, academic success. That's kind of my area that I've done my dissertation in. Specifically, I looked at preschoolers from low socioeconomic status and looking at things that help them with being ready for kindergarten, and then I followed them through third grade, which we know is a testing year. And so I really have a passion about students being successful academically, particularly looking around students of color being successful academically. And knowing that when you look at data, when you look at statistics and research, it shows that students of color, minority students, but particularly our African American boys, tend to have a large educational gap when you compare them with their peers. And so that has really laid near and dear to me to look at what ways can we support families in ensuring that our children are successful academically, because we know that it takes more than just educators, but we also have to have that parent engagement as well. And so just a little bit about our experience this evening. Just know that this is a very safe, brave space to discuss, exchange, and learn, and just be vulnerable. You know, if there are experiences that you've had that you would like to share, or you want, you know, just input about, you know, how could I help my son or daughter in this situation in school? Please know that this is a safe and brave space to share and exchange information. You know, I encourage you to, you know, kind of speak your truth, you know, talk about things that have been successful for your child or children, you know, talk about things that you would like to see happen as far as surrounding their academics. And really we'll have a, you know, mutual respect, understanding, and appreciation of all of us from a cultural perspective. So I encourage you to, you know, turn your video on for a building connection. You know, if you would like to raise your hand, you know, if you agree with something, there's a reaction button. You can type in the chat box, you know, if you don't necessarily want to come off mute and speak. So just want you to know that this is an opportunity, once again, for a community of learning. And so as we kind of get into this experience, I always like to do kind of this brief center, focus, and lean in. Because number one, given the time of evening, I know that we're all kind of like a woosah moment, right? You know, we've been going all day. And I just encourage you to just kind of take a deep breath. Even if you're in transition in your car or driving or what have you, I just encourage you just to take a deep breath. Inhale like you're sniffing great chocolate chip cookies, if you like chocolate chip cookies or whatever your favorite cookie is. Take a nice inhale, and I'm doing it myself. And then exhale like you're blowing out candles, okay? And so really centering ourselves, because we've been this hustle and bustle of just life in general, but because of the time of day, just really engaging ourselves so we can be focused and have a really rich discussion. Okay. All right. And so as we continue to look forward, so once again, you know, when we think about academic success, right? What are some things that come to your mind when you think about your child being academically successful? What are just some words that come to your mind?
One of the first words that came to mind for me was comprehension. And then I guess to add to that, just being focused.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any others? When I think about it, I'll share. I think about mutual respect between the child, the educator, and families. Mutual respect. Any other thoughts that may come as you think about what it means for your child to be academically successful? Okay. And so once again, you know, we look at this as, you know, not just a linear where it's just one thing that causes our children to be successful, but we know it's a multiple, kind of a multifaceted thing. So if we look at this diagram here, you'll see that I have one word in the center that talks about dialogue, right? And so here we're talking about really making sure that professionals are working together. And what does that mean? That means having conversations around what we feel are those key issues that will make our child successful. And so, as one of the parents just said, comprehension of those things. So when we talk about significance at the very top of this this chart, significance refers to what are those areas that are most important for families. Okay. Do our educators allow families to have this open dialogue that's very focused and outcome based on what the parents would like to see? Okay. Also, continuity and change. Is there a continuity when we talk about when concepts are introduced in the classroom? Is there a continuity from one academic goal to another? And do the educators recognize change as it relates to parent needs, and children's needs? Because we know that if there's any change, it may affect student success. And when I speak about change, I'm talking about if there's a different dynamics within the household. We know during the pandemic, there was a lot of increased research data on homelessness. We know that, some students were taking actual showers at the schools before schools actually started. And so we know that all of these things may affect students' focus and academic outcome. And so when we look at, once again, this cause and effect, we know that whatever is going on in that child or family's household or lifestyle, there's always a cause and effect. And our educators working together to understand what those things are. Place and space, really acknowledging that, depending on the culture of a child, right? We have to acknowledge that when we're providing this dialogue with families. And are we connecting with families? For so long, we see that connectivity be such an issue when we talk about cultural variations. And, I talk about this all the time. I have a son now who's 19, but when he was in elementary school, 90% of his teachers were white. And so there was always an issue with them thinking that he was being disruptive. But in actuality, he felt as though his voice wasn't being heard because when he would raise his hand, he was never called upon. And so once again, we look at this interconnectivity in terms of do our teachers, are they diverse enough to understand what the needs of diverse learners are? Does anyone have any story like that where they may have had a teacher that may have misinterpreted their child's nonverbal communication or even communication in general in the classroom? Anyone would like to share? Remember, this is a safe and brave space to share.
My son, Elijah, when you said it, he said, and so he had a teacher in first grade that she just didn't really care for him. And we didn't want to necessarily say that it was a black-white issue, but as we went through the years and people asked who we had for first grade, all of them would respond, even some of the teachers, with, oh no, she's racist. And so we had an issue with him, raising his hand and her not calling on him. And then when he would try to tell her that something was wrong or someone was doing something, she would say he was a tattletale. And so then one day, a little girl cried out for Elijah to help her. And Elijah went and helped her because the little boy was bullying her, and he punched the little boy in the mouth and bloodied his nose. And so she calls me and she says, well, Elijah knows to come to me for help. And I said, ma'am, do you know that you've been sending a note home every week telling me that he's a tattletale? And so now that he's not tattletaling, you're calling me to tell on him. I said, so you set the expectation and you set the standard for what he should do when he is not comfortable, when he has an issue. Oh no, well, that wasn't what I meant. Well, then understand that he is 7. He's 6, about to be 7, and you just told him not to tell. And now that he's telling, you've got a problem with it. Or now that he's not telling, you've got a problem with it. And so we didn't really mesh well. It turned him off from school altogether. This was a child that won reading competitions in pre-K. He was a stellar student in kindergarten, super excited about school. And it took from that first grade until about really third grade to get him back interested in school again. Like, he just had zero motivation. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to read. And to this day, I have challenges getting him to read. He's an honor student now, but he still doesn't have a desire to read anymore. And it all really started with that one teacher.
And you know what, Mom, that is a really good point, because I can even think with my son, and that's really impactful, because as you're talking, I was just kind of reflecting on, I can remember, one of the reasons why my son didn't continue. Well, he went to the area homeschool for middle school, but one of the reasons why he didn't go to the high school in this district is because the middle school and the elementary school experience almost deter him from enjoying school altogether. And I found that to be a pattern of behavior, to almost where he became very untrusting of teachers, because every time, it was always a negative connotation with him. And so, we'll talk about kind of the perspectives and action on this wheel here in a second, about what we can do as families, and to recognize that what if that may not be the best academic environment for our child. Our roles, rights, and responsibilities as parents is not only to do their home, help them do their homework, but to really assess the academic environment and to see if that academic environment continues to be the best for their academic success. Because a lot of times what I found is that, they may be very smart, your child may be very smart, but is the academic environment providing them an opportunity to shine and to demonstrate that? Are the teachers being receptive to what their potential can be? Or is it being masked behind what the teachers perceive as behavior issues? And research has shown that specifically, not necessarily girls, but specifically it has been very gender specific to African-American boys, that their quest for inquiry and asking questions and being helpful has been misinterpreted as behavior issues. And so we'll talk about, the perceptions and actions that we can take as parents to really look at this parent engagement piece is more defined than us just saying, we trust the teacher in telling us what is best for our child, but we have an obligation and a right as parents to even be engaged in their academic environment. And then I'll kind of talk about the journey with my son and how I did that for him for high school. Okay. All right. So being very intentional about working together and recognizing that as parents, we have a lot of power. We have a lot of power to engage in that process that I think a lot of parents don't realize that we have that power. I remember just recently, because I still do some consultation at a couple of charter schools in Greensboro and High Point in speech pathology. And I remember this mom telling me, my son, I really think that he has some stuttering issues, Dr. Mcquiddy. And I said, well, has he been in a speech program before? And she said, yes, he was in one when he was in preschool, but now he was in third grade. And the mom said, and I told her, I said, well, that you could have gotten him free special education services to address his stuttering when he entered public school. And she said, I had no idea. So he went from kindergarten all the way through third grade, and he was a severe stutterer and with no help. And the parents said, they just discharged him and didn't tell me that he could get additional services. And so once again, a lot of this parent engagement is also about parent empowerment, to really let parents know that, yes, you have a voice, and really working together collectively to ensure that your child is getting the services and is in an academic environment and culture that's really going to let them shine. So when we talk about working together, what does that look like? That looks at accountability, being authentic, being committed, a give and take, acknowledging diversity, and also, I'm sorry, let's go to the next one. And also making sure we do these things with educators, with us as parents and families, but also with our students. And we know that students have a voice. Even as young as, Mom, what you were saying, your son is listening and he is agreeing, because first grade, he felt that, he felt that just by his actions. And so once again, we have to acknowledge that students have a voice as well. And so if they're telling us different things, of course, we know, our students, it may be a little embellished, but we know the truth is somewhere in there, right? And so we have to give them credit for coming to us if they feel as though things are not just right. And so accountability, us being accountable in making sure that if we see that there are issues within the academic environment, we address those issues, and that we're very authentic with that. We're very transparent with educators, teachers, administrators of the school. I know a lot of my parents would tell me, well, Dr. Mcquiddy, that's the teacher and she's the expert, or he's the expert, that's the principal, and, they're the administrator. And I always have to remind them, well, remember, the principal is not in the classroom. The principal is the overseer. And so the principal, is just communicated information by the teacher. Remember, the teacher is in a classroom with probably 20 plus students. And so although the teacher is the expert, quote unquote, in the class, there's still pieces that the teacher may miss. So if you find that there are gaps in your child's education, be very authentic and transparent with that teacher and call a meeting. Don't be afraid to call a meeting with that teacher and administrator and say, these are some of my concerns, or these are things that I think are working. Can we continue these things? Because it doesn't always have to be a negative thing when you're requesting meetings, but it may be something positive that you find that is working for your child, and you want to bring that to the school's attention. And so I think as parents, we kind of saw during the pandemic that we were very accountable, right, for that remote learning. We had to be accountable that the child logged in. We had to be accountable that the child did the work and submitted the work. And so it gave parents a whole different perspective on the school day, on the expectations of the school. And so I've been encouraging parents to use those experiences to really know that, during this opportunity of really knowing the ins and outs of how the classroom kind of worked from that snapshot of remote learning, really be accountable and committed to ensure that as your child returns back to that face-to-face, and as they have returned back to that face-to-face environment, that we continue to ask questions, that we stay involved in that educational process, because it's going to take us being committed for our children to really progress after the pandemic. Research has shown that students, especially students that have already were at risk for academic delays, or students that were already in special education programs, it's going to take them about 2 to 3 years to really recover from the pandemic and not being in school. For students that were on grade level or exceptional students, those students are really having to go full swing back into face-to-face instruction. And so as parents, we really have to stay on top of that as our students return back. How have you all children been doing since they've been back? And did you see a gap in education from remote learning to now they're back face-to-face? And what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, my child needs the interaction with the teacher. And since she's been back in person, she's doing better.
Wonderful. I also have a 9th grader who's at the STEM college at A&T, and she just said, Mom, remote learning was the worst. She said, I think I was just, first of all, she said she was teaching herself. And then she said, I was just learning to memorize and just to get the assignments done. Because, let's just face it, Guilford County, they were pulling at straws because they, did not really know how to do remote and virtual learning. And so it was a learning curve for the school district. And so, it really, put us in a situation where, as you said, Mom, Ms. Jones, that face-to-face interaction, some students need that, especially when you're talking about diverse learners and students of color tend to be very kinesthetic, tactile, audio, auditory, and visual learners. They need it all. They need to hear it, see it, interact with it, do it, etc. And so we find that coming back to school has been a benefit for a lot of our students that are of color. Any other thoughts about that?
Well, my daughter, when we first went to remote, her first grade teacher was wonderful. He continued to do lives every day, and he even had one-on-ones with them in the afternoon, like he was doing during the school year with tutoring. That was first grade. Then when we started it again in second grade, she did miss a lot because that teacher didn't do as much, like you said before. And so it caused me to have, as a parent, to have to do extra stuff with her. And luckily I had the type of job that was flexible with that. Not everyone has that type of job. So, and that was a strain on parents. And my parents are also retired, so they helped also, but everybody doesn't have that village. And so it was very hard.
I totally agree. One of the schools that I work in is a Title IX charter school where probably 70% are Hispanic, living below the poverty level, and the other 30% are low socioeconomic African-American families. And when I tell you, they even struggle with having accessibility in internet, to where the schools had to give them personal accounts in order just to get Wi-Fi and have accessibility. And then you would have, some families that had the 8th grade daughter to make sure the 2nd grade son got on because the parents were working a double shift. And so a lot of those parents, I would help with doing some one-on-one tutoring, because a lot of those children had issues with comprehension and language and literacy and decoding and that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right, Mom. It really put those parents that don't have those rich resources really in a bind to make sure that their students were academically successful. And so, as we kind of come back, we're looking at how can we ensure that our children come back with a knowledge base that's going to get them to the next level. Mom, you were just talking about very critical years. We know from kindergarten to third grade, third grade marks that year of standardized testing. And they're holding students accountable to that standardized testing, even through the pandemic and even coming up in April and May. And so what kinds of things can we do to ensure that we work together with our educators to make sure that we're doing all we can, right? And so we talk about this in terms of, really telling our truth, what I call our truth, telling stories that can help connect and engage each other, engage educators, because a lot of times, you have to remember that teachers only see children in the snapshot of the class, right? They may share as they build rapport with their teacher, and as the teacher builds rapport with the students, but it's really only a snapshot. And so what I encourage, and I always tell this story, is that one of the things that I talk about with my own child, that I chose not for him to go back to that home high school, is because they couldn't understand his story. And so a lot of times we as parents have to be committed and engaged and be okay with looking at alternatives to ensure that our children are academically successful. And so I didn't necessarily want a private school experience because, number one, it's costly, right? But I did want an experience that would allow him to be what I call his authentic self, right? So we talk about being authentic. We talk about having students being able to tell their story so they can connect. We find that students are successful when they're able to look at their academic experiences from an experiential lens. And so what I did for him was he was able to go to the middle college at A&T, which is an all boys high school on A&T's campus. And their premise was really looking at African-American boys really finding their authentic self, really having a commitment to ensure that their story is told. And of course, that may not be the story for every child, but what I do encourage parents to do when we talk about this engagement and empowering parents is really to look at your children and think about, number one, are they able to tell their story from an academic lens where they currently are? Are we able to provide partnerships and, implement partnerships with their educator? So their educator and the partners, the teachers, et cetera, can really, really, really understand what they need from an academic perspective. And so when we think about this storytelling and being culturally responsive, how do you all feel now about where your children currently are? Do you feel as though their academic success is really a commitment within their educational environment, in their academic environment? Why or why not?
Well, I actually I can answer that, but then I have a question.
Sure.
I feel like academically, he's fine. I mean, all through the pandemic, I learned that teaching is not my ministry, not to children. Grown-ups I could deal with, but the children, that's not my ministry. And so once we recognized that, we were able to pivot. His stepmom is a teacher. And so we were able to just swap the schedule and make it work. And so we were really blessed to have that as an option because he was definitely suffering with me at the helm. But as far as his progress since that situation with the teacher, he definitely made progress. But I do wonder, because as a mom, I was ready to kind of swoop in and have him taken out of that class. His dad, however, had a different perspective, and it was that if we rescue him every time, he won't know how to adapt.
Mhm.
And I appreciated that perspective, but I also didn't want him to have damage. You know what I'm saying? So I do, for me, I want to make sure that I provide for him a safe space to learn where he feels comfortable learning and asking questions. But at the same time, I don't want him to be crippled and not know how to adapt. Now, second grade, I get, I felt like if he didn't adapt, he was going to be okay anyway. But it's sixth grade, seventh grade, as he gets older, I do want to make sure that I'm still giving him space to learn how to adjust and adapt to people he doesn't like, people in authority positions that he doesn't get along with. How does he handle that? How can he navigate that situation? Because real life is coming very quickly, and I don't want him to feel like he's got to just run from it. I want him to be comfortable facing adversity and facing people that are in positions of authority that he doesn't necessarily respect, but learn how to respectfully carry himself, handle himself, and do what he needs to do and get out of there and go back home and still be who he is as a person. So I think I'm really wanting to make sure that he is a balanced individual that can manage his emotions and how he can handle people and not necessarily feel like he has to be rescued from it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a really good point. And to your point, I think that was one of the reasons why I waited until high school to do the transition, because I wanted to give him that perspective of being able to understand that there will be adversity, and that how do you handle those things, but and also in that same breath, with those things, and everybody knows their child, right? So, just keeping observing, because we know there's an academic side of children, but we also know there's a mental health and social aspect of children. And so with that being said, you try to find that balance for them, and allow them to kind of develop and guide them through that balancing process. And so as a parent, as you continue to navigate, especially middle school, you will find that balance in terms of if this environment is still conducive, from my perspective of what I did for my son, or if he needed another opportunity. And I think for me, it was really, there wasn't a good balance where he was. And so for me, I needed him to be in an environment where there was a cultural balance, but there was also attention that was also paid to not just being a smart student, but also preserving mental health and social, emotional, and social intelligence. And so that was, from my perspective. But your point is well taken, that we really have to allow our students, especially this generation, because it's so many different things pulling and tugging at them, that when and I have to always kind of take a step back, when I'm working with students at A&T, and I always say, well, where's your resilience? Where's your grit? But a lot of these students, I didn't necessarily have to deal with all the social media, the social influences, because I'm a millennial. So I was raised by a baby boomer, and so you just did what you had to do. You just didn't ask any questions. It was just is what it was just that. But a lot of this generation, and we're doing at A&T a lot of our advising, we're having a lot of speakers come in so we can understand the type of students that we're teaching now, because it's so different. And so we have to recognize that this is a generation of students of inquiry. They ask questions. When I was in college, I would never think to go straight to the dean's office or to the provost. These students will go straight to the dean's office and to the provost and won't think twice about it. So it's a culture of thinking also, and a diverse learner that we have to recognize as well. And it's taking an adjustment. I will be very transparent. It's taking an adjustment because I'm like, okay, so you had to work tonight, but the work was still due at midnight. So why isn't it in? We just balanced it. We just did what we had to do. So, point well taken, Mom. Any other thoughts about that? Okay. So once again, really just recognizing, with that whole parent empowerment and engagement and academic success, our children, have that voice. They have a story to tell that I think that is very important in order to connect both academically and socially with them being successful with their academic progress. Very, very important. And I think more so than anything else, the pandemic has shown us that, right? That we have had an increasing number of students in elementary school, 11 and 12-year-olds committing suicide during the pandemic. I actually had a student, a graduating senior who had a 12-year-old sister back in Atlanta that committed suicide in her own room of her house during the pandemic because of the social isolation. And so we're living, with those kinds of circumstances that we have to be able to understand. It's about working as a team, looking at educational experiences from the lens of the child who's the ultimate beneficiary, but also recognizing that parents are partners and working with educators as well. So any questions about that? And so what I really want to have the takeaways from this is a couple of things. The biggest takeaway is to really acknowledge this idea of advocacy, okay? Advocacy as a parent and recognizing that it takes us working together in order to penetrate academic success. And so what does that look like, advocacy? Advocacy looks like having those hard conversations that need to be had with administrators and educators. Advocacy looks at connecting when you see there is a disconnect between the academic performance and recognizing mental health, which there's a whole body of research now that's talking about those two ideas are very much correlated. A child who has very good mental health tend to be very strong academically as well. Okay. And then after advocacy, the biggest other takeaway is that recognize that our children have a story, okay? They have an educational story and which is surrounded by their experiences. And so we need to make sure that those stories are being told. When the educators may see a disconnect, we ask those questions and we encourage our children to ask questions. And then finally, we need to ensure that we're looking at and making sure that our educators are looking at an education from a cultural responsive lens. Okay. A culturally responsive lens. So if they don't understand or misinterpret our children being helpful or our children trying to ask questions, that we provide that empowerment to educators, okay? That we have a voice and that we speak out on their behalf. And so really, I always like to say when we think about, academics and being academically successful, I go back to the initial question I asked, what do you think about when you think about academic success? And we talk, I think some moms said, comprehension, being focused. But I also want us to think about academic success being in addition to the academics of the classroom, but also that mutual respect that is built between the parents, the educators within the school, including administrators, and most importantly, the students that are being educated. Okay. So we will leave the next couple of minutes, and I'm not sure, Ms. Erica, you kind of give me a time check. I just kind of get on this and get on a soapbox here, but we'll leave a few minutes now for any big takeaways from parents, or do you look at academics differently, or what were your biggest takeaways? I'll stop sharing now. So if there aren't any, I think we kind of shared as we went along in the presentation. So I'll kind of turn it over for